I came to Greenwich Village because I wanted to see the bohemian life, the place where it all started, where the art scene started, where the literature started.
Everyone that I spoke to that hung out in the village was up on liberal politics, they were up on jazz, they were up on theater.
It was a crazy scene in the village. There was anything, there was everything.
The village has always been fighting authority. If it stands for anything, it's épater le bourgeois.
It has a history that has encouraged people to say, we can go to the village and be ourselves.
In 1963, my father was a folk singer, and if you were a folk singer looking for work at that time, Greenwich Village was a place to be. And they moved us here into this bustle and excitement and creativity. I was a kid walking down the street with my baseball glove going to play softball. And I was walking next to Allen Ginsberg and Bob Dylan, and I didn't know it at the time, but that's what really astonishes me about my childhood is I was in the middle of this genius and these gems of personalities and gems of creative individuals, and I had no idea. I was a child of the 60s and a child of Greenwich Village. There was always some kind of issue that was being dealt with that you could, walking down the street, you knew about it. It was not like you were particularly educated from the newspaper, and the newspaper was half the time going to lie to you anyway. There was a real intelligence on the street and a real awareness on the street of what was happening. You knew that there was going to be a peace march on Saturday. I grew up in a very interesting place. Didn't understand it till much later.
It was one committed protest 200 years ago that gave Greenwich Village its unique character. In 1811, New York was growing so rapidly that city commissioners decided to put all the streets of Manhattan on an orderly grid. But this area of the young city was already established, and villagers wanted to keep their property the way it was, with the boundaries formed by the old Indian paths and streams. After a hard-fought battle, the villagers won. While the rest of the city would go on the grid plan, the streets of Greenwich Village would remain separate and distinct. The stage was now set for decades of challenging the establishment, first in civic planning, and later in art, theater, literature, music, and social and political movements. It would become a sanctuary for people wanting to reinvent and define themselves.
I'd read about the village, how bohemian it was, and it was filled with creative artists. And after I got thrown out of college and left home, I couldn't wait to get here.
From time to time, Langston Hughes, in his journals, one would hear that he and others had gone down to the village. And I had not even been to New York. But that I knew that someday I'd get down to the village.
You have to understand that in Brooklyn, when we were adolescents, which is back in the late 30s, there was one idea above all, and that was to get laid. You know, we talked about it all the time. We brooded about it. We discussed various techniques. We thought about it. And Greenwich Village was Mecca. The idea was if a girl lived in Greenwich Village, then she could be had. So the village always had this wonderful patina about it, that it was an exciting place where extraordinary things could happen. And to a 16-year-old, nothing was more extraordinary than the idea that, yes, you could get laid. I didn't get to live in the village until about 1955. The village has always been fighting authority. They loathe the idea of a bourgeois world. One of the great ironies is that today, unless you lived pretty high up in that bourgeois world, you can't afford an apartment here in the village. But that's neither here nor there for the moment. Back there in the 50s, life was quite enjoyable in a way. The sense of freedom was intoxicating. All that was, you might say, was a stock, a brew, that underwrote much of what I wrote and thought. Some writers love getting together. So Vance Bourget got the idea that we ought to form something, we ought to do something about it. We'd meet here, I think it was every Sunday afternoon. Those people who could come would come, and we'd gather in the back room of the White Horse. We felt that the village had an intense history of writers. I mean, so many writers have been here. You know, we'd pass Patchen Place and say, that's where E.E. Cummings used to live. And there were rumors that Dos Passos had lived in the village. We'd hear stories that William Faulkner had passed through the village. The village meant that writers who were essentially freer congregated here.
Throughout its history, more writers lived and worked in Greenwich Village than any other place in America. In the early 1900s, village authors used their work to denounce social injustice. Many of these writers lived off Washington Square in an old rooming house nicknamed the House of Genius. And still more writers came throughout the 20th century.
What is hip or square? The alternative that each new generation coming into American life is beginning to feel. One is a rebel or one conforms. One is a frontiersman in the wild west of American nightlife, or else a square cell, trapped in the totalitarian tissues of American society, doomed willy-nilly to conform if one is to succeed.
When I chose to move to Greenwich Village, I knew that space was a premium. Obviously, we're all in small spaces here. So when I came into this room, it was like a blank canvas, and thankfully I have high ceilings, so I was able to add space where there wasn't any. So I built this loft with the steps coming down. And then just piece by piece, I went through and started with the CD cases and worked my way over videos, books, and computer desk. I did all the wiring myself. My dad was a contractor, so when I was in first grade, actually, our house burnt down, and he rebuilt it. And at 6 years old, he handed me a putty knife and said, "Get the low spots," and started me spackling. Thankfully, my parents have been really great. If ever I wanted to learn something that they did, they taught me. I grew up in a little town about 60 miles north of Manhattan. Typical suburban upbringing, one brother, two parents, 2.3 kids, 2 cars, lower middle class, very typical. Moving down to Greenwich Village enabled me to be who I wanted to be. I didn't have to hide behind everyone else's ideals. I've become the person that I always wanted to be, and I don't have to hide it.
It was given to me anyway, but I hated it. It was horrible.
You stopped using it?
Because I know a lot of girls that I dated that have parents who's like, it's very gross. How should
There was a counterculture in Greenwich Village as early as the 1850s. Its roots go back to Paris. American free thinkers looking for intellectual stimulation mingled in left bank cafes with French artists and writers. They were called Bohemians, after the gypsies who came out of Bohemia in Central Europe. When some of these American expatriates returned to the U.S., they gravitated to Greenwich Village, where they discovered an out-of-the-way beer hall owned by German immigrant Charles Pfaff. A dim, smoky basement that respectable society stayed away from. In this underground cave, Bohemian ideas and radical talk could flourish. Poet Walt Whitman held court at Pfaff's. Some of the regulars published the Saturday Press to promote their radical ideas. It's often been considered the first countercultural newspaper in America. As the Civil War approached, Pfaff's closed. But Bohemian life was here to stay. As the editor of Puck magazine wrote at the time, they have started a tradition which will survive from generation to generation.
I couldn't wait to get to New York and go down to the village because I was from San Francisco and I'm from a middle-class black family. My mother said whenever we went downtown, we wore gloves. Ladies wore gloves, you wore little pearls. And there were certain things that you just didn't do. You weren't a bohemian. And when I got to the village, I thought, like Brer Rabbit in a briar patch. I thought, home at last, home at last. I sang in the nightclubs. I sang folk songs, particularly calypso. Sometimes my ear was not as good as I would like. So quite often I sang off pitch. But I'd make up for it by dancing. So many of the artists I loved, especially the poets, had connections with Greenwich Village. I enjoyed the daring of innocent Vincent Millay. And this woman wrote, in the village, I shall die, but that is all I will do for death. With his horse's hooves on my chest, I will not tell him where the black boy lies hidden in the swamp. Brothers and sisters, the keys and the plans to the city are safe with me. Through me you will never be overthrown, for I shall die, but that is all I will do for death. Now, I loved her so.
Well, you know what happened here?
There's Minettas.
I used to go to Minettas with Lucian Carr and Kerouac and Burroughs.
Yes, and me.
And Joe Gould came
Joe Gould, yeah. He sit in the corner.
Here's where we first read poetry in New York.
And that day it was called the, what they
Gaslight.
The Gaslight Cafe.
During the 1950s, poetry was read in smoky coffee houses by beat poets like Allen Ginsberg, Gregory Corso, Jack Kerouac, and William Burroughs.
Girls, you want to learn to swing, you want to be able to dig and take in everything, you dig everything, as poet Allen Ginsberg said. Now dig me, pretty babies. You must love your life out and live by loving every minute in it. You should learn everything you can in school, then come out and use it against them. You should visit a psychiatrist as often as you visit a dentist, once a year. You must love your life out. You must love your life out and live by loving every...
Ginsberg was in the village. I liked his poetry. And, you know, he was using language and imagery that had to do with a world that I could see. You know, like I said, in the 50s, poetry was controlled, as it's seeking to be controlled again, by the deadest of the academics. If you didn't use Greek and Latin and some other concatenation of other, you know, quasi-erudite, you know, BS, you know, it wasn't supposed to be poetry.
What must a poet look like? Should he have long white hair parted down the middle and publish yearly homey verse? No, I could never wear pork pie hats to fill space in news magazines. Lightning walked over the windshield as the wipers squeaked in time on the glass like angry reptiles. How wonderful on a journey to find a place where the eyes can rest, the blood refresh itself. Thank you.
I didn't plan on coming to Greenwich Village, but once I discovered it, it has been my home since 1971. I grew up in Israel. Both my parents pioneered the kibbutz. It was very much kind of a socialist background. But for whatever reason, I started to feel, especially growing up, that it wasn't my place. It was as if it was too small for what I wanted for myself. I moved to London. But even in London, I started to feel that I was falling asleep standing. I decided to come to New York. I found this abandoned hat factory in Greenwich Village. It was a raw space, and I converted it into a living working space. Financially, one had to be resourceful to survive. It was creating a life basically out of what was around, converting it from one use to another. I'm interested in movement, but not in the external movement of things, but really its internal movement. What it is, it's like music, but not imitating music. It's finding visual music. And that's the nature of my work, the relationship between some kind of a classical approach, but with a certain kind of inner freedom to break the structure, to find the structure and to break the structure.
Painters originally flocked to the village because of a radical new experiment, the 10th Street Studio. Started in 1858, this was the first time a building was designed with artists in mind. Studios were large and bright and could be used by artists to display their work. Among the first to arrive was the Hudson River School of Landscape Painters, artists such as Frederick Church and William Hart. The success of the 10th Street Studio drew still more artists to the neighborhood. Radical and controversial art movements followed. In the early 1900s, painting, like literature, took on a social awareness. Artists John Sloan and Robert Henri painted scenes of the working class and immigrants. But critics called their work garbage and labeled them the Ashcan School. These and other painters staged a historic art show at the New York Armory in 1913, when they shocked the American public by introducing them to the leading artists of Paris. Artists such as Marcel Duchamp, with his painting Nude Descending the Staircase. But the show was such a success, it forever changed the way Americans looked at art. Half a century later, the abstract expressionist painters in the village were painting what they felt were the inner workings of the mind, again freeing painting from its traditional form. And important art movements would continue in Greenwich Village as long as affordable spaces were available.
I'm at a turning point in my life because I am being evicted from this space. I've lived here for 27 years. But the owner of the building, which is NYU, New York University, they have decided that they need it for their own use, and they've given us some time to get out of what was not only our home and basically a way of life. So you can live here for 30 years, they leave you alone, but when they need the space, you're out.
Pick me.
I don't even know who's married to anymore. He's got so many wives. You don't
It's
have
okay,
to be a
it's
friend.
okay, mine's very new, it's okay.
Yeah.
You're not worried
Talking.
about it.
He is something else to talk to.
Good evening, everyone. I want to welcome you here to the Cornelia Street Cafe. Welcome to the Songwriters Beat. We have an absolutely stellar lineup of performers tonight for you.
If you'd offered me deception, it might have altered my perception, but you could not hide from me those thoughts that you were feeling.
I had heard about Greenwich Village. There was a lot of jazz clubs there. It was 1945. I had an older brother that was a musician as well, and I would hear him talking about people like Billie Holiday walking down the street with some smoke in their hands, smoking and casual and the whole thing. Cafe Society was in the heart of Greenwich Village. In 1950, I was playing with Charlie Parker, and we went into Cafe Society for 4 weeks opposite Art Tatum, one of the greatest pianists of all times. And I'll never forget, opening night, Billie Holiday even came and sat in and sang with us. And it was such a great feeling, the feeling of Greenwich Village, Cafe Society, and the whole thing.
Jazz has been a part of village nightlife since the 1920s. But the club that would have the most impact was Cafe Society at 2 Sheridan Square. Opened in 1939 by Barney Josephson, a shoe salesman from New Jersey, Cafe Society became the first white-owned integrated jazz club in America. With its left-wing overtones, it mixed entertainment and politics. It became a hangout for jazz lovers, intellectuals, union organizers, and black celebrities like boxer Joe Louis and actor Paul Robeson. And here, Billie Holiday sang haunting songs of racial injustice. Because of Cafe Society's left-wing, integrated environment, the club was a target of bigotry and negative press, and so was Barney Josephson. Josephson's brother Leon, a communist, was brought to the House Un-American Activities Committee. Barney Josephson became guilty by association. The continual bad publicity caused the club to close in 1950. Although Cafe Society closed, other jazz clubs that started around the same time continued.
My husband, Max Gordon, opened the Vanguard in 1935
Max came from Portland, Oregon after graduating Reed College, and he was an intellectual and a thinker and a writer, and where do you go with those kind of qualities? Even though his mother wanted him to be a lawyer, but he did come to the village, and in order to meet people that he liked, he had to open a little club somewhere so he could bring people together. It was his salon, his living room, and the walls were bare, and there were barrels for seats. The object was to have a place for poets to speak. People would throw money on the floor. That was what they got paid. Yul Brynner played guitar here. Maya Angelou sang here and played guitar. I remember when Thelonious Monk played here for the first time, nobody even heard of Thelonious Monk outside of musicians. There's Branford Marsalis and Jimmy Heath up there. I hate to point, but that's who it is. And there's Charlie Mingus and Rahsaan Roland Kirk. Mingus made quite a splash in the days when he played here, beside breaking the door down and knocking a lamp down and hitting a couple customers with his bass. He was a very excitable man. Dinah Washington, well, there was nobody who sang quite like Dinah Washington. And Bill Evans, who I spoke about before, all hunched over there at the piano, his favorite position, looking like a wounded bird. And J.J. Johnson, he made me stop smoking. I never forgot him. Miles Davis came, John Coltrane played. It was just endless array of great talent that happened in this club.
When I decided to become a comedian, a number of the nightclubs where young comedians could start were in Greenwich Village. You could go on, not for any money, but you always had an audience, and they were a good audience. They were an intelligent audience, and they were a serious audience. They were not, drunks or hostile. They were on your side from the minute you came out. I worked all the time with Bill Cosby, for example. He would go on at the Village Gate, and I'd go on at the bitter end, or vice versa. And we'd finish our shows, and we'd meet and walk around on Bleecker Street and on Thompson Street together and just hang out and talk for an hour, and then we'd both go back and do our shows again, and then meet and walk, and then do our third shows. And of course, Lenny Bruce was playing down there. When I was performing in the Village, there were many wonderful plays that were there. The whole Eugene O'Neill Renaissance came about in Greenwich Village, and the new playwrights were putting on their things in the Village. It was a wonderful, wonderful atmosphere for someone interested in plays and the theater.
There were always small theaters doing experimental work. Broadway has always been more concerned with commerce than with art. Occasionally something halfway decent used to show up there, not very much anymore. And so there was a need for the small basement and 200-seat theaters that Off-Broadway provided. the history of off-Broadway goes a long, long way back, and it goes back to the Provincetown Playhouse and in the 20s and early productions of early plays by Eugene O'Neill.
Although many new theater troupes emerged in the village in the 1920s, the most influential was the Provincetown Players, which incorporated painters and poets as well as actors. It was here that one of the most important playwrights of the 20th century found a home. Eugene O'Neill wrote many plays at the Provincetown Playhouse, but the one that caused the most scandal was a play about an interracial couple. The Society for the Suppression of Vice called for the play to be banned. Bomb threats were received. But despite these setbacks, the play ran for 5 months, helping to pave the way for later controversial playwrights in the village.
I wrote the Zoo Story as a kind of 30th birthday present to myself. That was my deadline. I either had to start amounting to something as a writer by my 30th birthday, or perhaps I didn't know what I was going to do. And so I wrote it when I was 29. 238 West 4th Street, 3rd floor, front, west. Had a rickety kitchen table, a Western Union typewriter, which I'd stolen from the Western Union Company where I was delivering telegrams. Yellow paper, which I'd also liberated from the Western Union Company. And the play just happened. When I wrote the play, I had friends who started sending it to theater people in New York, but nobody wanted anything to do with an hour-long, rather unpleasant play set on a park bench in Central Park with 2 people, one of whom ends up dead at the end of the play. Nobody was interested in that in a commercial theater. They all turned it down. And of course, it was done off-Broadway, where it should have been.
We were all libertarians. We just believed that if everyone had the maximum of freedom, that life would be better. And of course, the village is almost built on that notion. The village has always been fighting authority.
NYU, there still is time. Negotiate with the bottom line. NYU, there still is time. Negotiate with the bottom line.
Women's right to vote, workers' right to organize, the freedom to give out birth control information without being arrested. These were issues that were being fought for in the village in the years before World War I. And in the village, radical talk led to action. Founded in 1911, The Masses was often referred to as the most dangerous publication in America. It published articles about the Socialist Party and labor problems, with Max Eastman, a young socialist, as its chief editor. One of its star writers, John Reed, was sent to Russia to cover the growing revolution. Fitting in with the Russian people, he sent his stories about their struggle back home to the masses. The growing Bolshevik Revolution terrified America, and this became a time of severe attacks on civil liberties and free speech. The editors of The Masses were brought to trial by the Justice Department under the Espionage Act, and although they were not convicted, they were banned from selling the magazine. If they couldn't change America, villagers had another idea. One winter night in 1917, artists John Sloan, Marcel Duchamp, and several political activists climbed to the top of Washington Square Arch. Firing cap pistols into the air, they declared Greenwich Village to be an independent republic, separate and free from the rest of the country.
open real close. Oh. Hi, Greg. Ballad.
Make a whole bunch of wishes. You're gonna blow it once. And then blow it twice.
Well, whatever was happening historically, I was part of. My name is Jean Murray, and to my surprise, I am now 87 years old. I was brought up in a very working-class family in Brownsville, where Papa was making $9 a week. When you live in a poor neighborhood, there are problems. There were evictions, and there was hunger. But it was all of our problems. It just wasn't one family, so that we helped each other. But from that point on, I was always aware of the world outside. And so my taste was to come to the village where everything was happening. We were always in some cause. There was then the union organizing, the Spanish Civil War, the Rosenberg's case. There was Vietnam, there was Korea. Everything that happened politically and socially happened and had its source in the kind of people that came to the village. This is where I lived, and this is where I found my support. Here's a bit of a song that really expresses my feelings, just a bit of it. There's a beat in my heart, in my heart. There's a beat in my heart, in my heart. There's a beat for every smile, every man, woman, and child. There's a beat in my heart, in my heart. There's a tear in my heart, in my heart. There's a tear in my heart, in my heart. There's a tear from mother's son, falling lifeless from a gun. There's a tear in my heart, in my heart. There's a song in my heart, in my heart. There's a song in my heart, in my heart. There's a song for you and me, always growing, always free. There's a song in my heart, in my heart.
The way the Chumleys came about, Lee Chumley, who was a wobbly, a union organizer and journalist from the shipyards in Seattle, made his way east and attracted his writer friends to come together in one place and have a place to drink, which was illegal at that time, and also to write. And many of the writings that you'll see around the walls are socialist and communist in their bent. All of these writers were local residents. These books are actually on the subject matter of the hard philosophy of, is Leninism, is Marxism good for the United States? The table that I'm standing at now is the famous Table 8 at Chumley's. This is the booth that the Fitzgeralds, Scott and Zelda, held as their favorite table. It was also Humphrey Bogart's favorite table. It was rumored that the Fitzgeralds consummated their marriage here at their wedding reception. The books in this area were written by the Hollywood 10. Joseph McCarthy put on trial in the early 50s, and these people, as a moment of protest, did not go to the trials. They actually, on an early black and white TV, watched their own trials from these tables. When someone was in trouble, there would often be a basket on the bar where people would put in funds and bail someone out of jail or get them out of the FBI office. Into the 50s, we find Jack Kerouac. And this was a real community that attracted writers, artists in that bohemian part of society as well.
I grew up in Brooklyn, and I had a bunch of friends, and we used to sing together. Some of the older guys started calling us beatniks, and we didn't know what it meant. We just had not a clue. So we came over here to find out what beatniks were. We ended up in the Gaslight Cafe with a lot of the great poets at that time, Ginsberg and Kerouac and all those guys in the late 50s. So I came every weekend for a year and a half just about. In between the poetry, they'd have folk singers, traditional and contemporary. I never would have thought of myself as getting on a stage, singing by myself. But I heard so many songs that changed my life. So I sort of borrowed a guitar, and I started that way.
You had Peter, Paul and Mary, you had John Sebastian, you had Bob Dylan, you had Tom Paxton, you had all these guys walking around the village looking for jobs.
People didn't worry about having their material sung or who was going to make a big fortune, because frankly, nobody was making any real money. It wasn't about money, it wasn't about success. It wasn't about protest either. It was about affirming something fresh and wonderful.
The kind of thing you'd work out a new arrangement to a tune or something like that, and you'd immediately run over to the caricature of Pandora's to show it off. And if it was any good, you'd know it because in a week or 2 weeks, everybody else would be doing the same song.
I found my way to Gertie's first, which was really an Italian joint where the owner, Mike Porco, had figured out that he could sell a lot more pasta and a lot more red sauce if he had folk singers come along. And so he had Tom Paxton, and he had Peter Yarrow, and Joan Baez, Mimi Farina, Mary Travers, of course. And the village was just cooking. It was just seething with talent.
So here I was in this exotic village place, and you couldn't applaud in there apparently because the noise of the applause went up the air shafts and of the tenement, and the residents complained. And so the way you applauded was you snapped your fingers. You know, it sounded like a cricket invasion or something.
In 1961, Robert Zimmerman left his home in Minnesota and performed at Gertie's Folk City in Greenwich Village. Upon arriving in New York, he changed his name to Bob Dylan.
Rambling out of the Wild West, leaving the towns I love the best. Thought I'd seen some ups and downs till I came into New York town. People going down to the ground, buildings going up to the sky.
I remember Bob Dylan when he first came to town. Must have been 19 years old. Looked like a little cherub in an overcoat. Always carried his guitar with him. Slept on people's floors.
I swung on to my old guitar, grabbed hold of a subway car. After rocking, reeling, rolling ride, I landed up on the downtown side. Greenwich Village.
Bob Dylan influenced me a great deal because his music was inclusive.
And it was full of the passion of a young man who had discovered the iniquities of life
and used the folk format to say it.
I walked down there and ended up in one of them coffee houses on the block. I'd get on the stage, sing and play. Man, there say, come back some other day. You sound like a hillbilly. We want folk singers here.
On Sunday afternoons, hundreds of musicians with guitars and banjos and auto harps and fiddles would play blues and folk music in Washington Square Park, and huge crowds would gather. They were incredible jam sessions. Some great blues musicians, great old-time banjo players. It was very alive and fresh and just full of life. And at one time, the city fathers decided that this was not appropriate behavior, that the park was meant for strollers and people sitting on benches, and that the folk music was sort of a radical hippie element. So they banned the singing in the park.
So we were talking about Sergeant Christensen, though, we can make it then.
You are violating the law by coming in here.
Why?
What violation? You filed the application for the permit. It was denied.
That's right, but it was denied for a capricious reason rather than an illegal reason.
We don't know the reason. That's up to Commissioner Morris.
But it's not up to Commissioner Morris to tell the people what kind of music is good or bad. He's telling the people that folk music brings degenerates and bad people. It's not so.
We want to call the attention to all the people of New York City that we want to keep free singing and free playing in this park.
The outcome of what they called the Washington Square Folk Music Riot was that they allowed singing right after that. It was only about a couple of weeks afterwards that they said, sure, come on back, because we can't deal with this outcry, this public outcry. You know, back then, folk music and blues represented the far left wing. It's very different than it is today. So anyone who had long hair and played a guitar and hung out in Greenwich Village was, by definition, dangerous to the state and a radical.
Politics was, right from the beginning, was part of the music. You had, after all, you had young Bob Dylan writing politically right from the beginning. You had Phil Oakes, myself. You had people singing political songs that they hadn't necessarily written.
All of that music was ammunition to bring about this sense, you know, this sense of what America is supposed to be, and what kids grew up in the 50s like me believing it was and finding out it wasn't.
Ultimately, that vision translated itself into a set of new rules by which people felt that we could behave. And those became the boundaries that were then crossed when the war in Vietnam took place and when the civil rights movement. But initially, it was all a forward thrust.
My name is Bill. I grew up in a small town in Louisiana. I always carried an awful lot of loneliness with me. Within a short time after being in school, I came to know that I was very different from my playmates, and more I became isolated from them. I did not discover exactly what homosexuality was until 10th grade or so. I was so convinced that I was a total mistake. I went into the Navy with high hopes, which were immediately dashed because I realized I couldn't be comfortable in a barrack situation. And at sea, when lights were out on a deck, I would go up and I would try prayer. I thought if I tried this with enough strength, maybe God would change me. I had a tremendous wish to be like other people. After the war, after my service in the Navy, I came to the village, and I found it easy to go to a club and relate to people, be open and about myself, about my sexuality, about who I was for the first time. And this was a tremendously exciting time for me.
Throughout its history, gay people had always come to the village. They sensed that a place known for tolerance would accept even sexual nonconformists. As early as the 1920s, there were dozens of clubs geared toward homosexuals. And although there was more acceptance in the village than in other places, gay people continued to be persecuted, even in the liberated 60s. But something happened in June 1969 that was so important it would change gay rights forever. And it happened at the Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village.
The Stonewall was the bar that gay kids went dancing at in the village. It was a place where you went as a gay person. It was where you went as a gay street kid. It was the only place you could find people like you. It was the only place where you could have some kind of feeling of family.
Unlike many homosexual clubs, it wasn't hidden on a narrow street, and its undisguised location made it a continual target of police raids.
You'd be inside the bar, the lights would come on, and you know the police would come in. You would immediately stop dancing. You'd hope that you had some ID on you, because otherwise you'd be arrested for being a vagrant. People were in fear of losing their jobs, people were in fear of losing their families, being evicted from their homes. We were tired of this.
So when the police raided the Stonewall Inn for the second time in 1 week at the end of June 1969, gay patrons had finally had enough.
The police were bringing people out of the bar, so we decided we would fight back. Garbage cans got lit, Molotov cocktails were being thrown, more police came, 20-year-old kids were being hit with bats, were being clobbered. Fire hose got turned on the crowd. It's like being in the middle of a war zone.
Hundreds came to join the fight. The riots lasted for 6 days, convulsing the heart of Greenwich Village.
After the Stonewall riots, gay youth decided to organize. We started with Gay Liberation Front. Out of Gay Liberation Front came Gay Activist Alliance, where we decided what we would take things over. We would have kiss-ins and go into straight bars and start kissing each other. We were a new generation of gay kids who said, we don't want this harassment anymore. We have the right to dance. We have the right to be with the person we love. We have the right, as every American has, to be an American and to have this.
Today, the success of the Stonewall riots is celebrated annually worldwide, with gay pride events at the end of June.
Something happened in the 80s that was really horrible, and it was the gentrification of the Greenwich Village, the yuppification of it, where these people, there were these richer professional types started buying up a lot of the brownstones and beautiful properties, and it became about wealth and not about creativity and tolerance. And when I came back in '86, I think, and I was shocked. at all the different franchises that had opened and all the different people I was seeing on the street, and it had changed. And major magazines writing about the hip place to live, Greenwich Village.
You know, the co-optation of Bohemia and the left has been going on for probably more than a century. I think it was almost inevitable that anything that works in America is sooner or later is picked up by a conglomerate. Everything has been co-opted, and the big money is everywhere.
One of those responsible for changing the face of Greenwich Village was New York University, situated right on Washington Square. For decades, they gobbled up property around the village, changing it for its own use, dormitories, office buildings, and an enormous law school. Although New York University continued to take over more and more of the landmarks in the village, the House of Genius, the home of Edgar Allan Poe, the Provincetown Playhouse, and others. And although big developers continued to build high-rises that would dwarf the intimate brownstones, villagers continued to challenge the status quo.
And what is New York University telling those young men and women studying law in this law school? What it is telling them is that might makes right. That with enough power, enough money, enough slick legal advice, you can take away people's homes and green spaces and beauty and history and their very neighborhood. For a high-rise behemoth that is about as welcome in Greenwich Village as Adolf Hitler at a bar mitzvah. And what, pray tell me, is all of this being destroyed for? A Tower of Babel to manufacture something this nation or this city does not need: more lawyers.
There's still a spirit. The core is still there, and that's very encouraging. When I walk around, I still feel it at times. That, you know, that the way it was and still is.
There are thousands of people who have come through Greenwich Village, artists and musicians and actors and activists, and they've taken what they've learned here and brought it to the four corners of the world. Without seeing the brackets. Right. So, I mean, how much... I was not born in Greenwich Village, and I may not die here, but what I've learned here, I can take wherever I end up. This is where I grew, where I came into my own.
It's not an accident that the village keeps recreating itself, phoenix-like. You know, it goes through little periods where nothing is happening, and then all of a sudden it starts to cook again.
It's just nice, it's soothing to be able to have a large space like the village was. It was a generous space where you could commiserate with your friends and kvetch and talk about how unfair things are.
It was a camaraderie of thinking, a camaraderie of feeling, a camaraderie of understanding, compassion, whatever you want to call it. It was the camaraderie of understanding the plight of many, many other people. That dispersed itself around the world and America.
Greenwich Village was a place where you could be free and creative and surrounded by your peers, and the energy multiplied exponentially so that it became sort of a real breeding ground, as you will, for great creative work.
Out of the village came these sensibilities, these pronouncements about life and about courage. And I believe that courage is the most important of all the virtues, because without courage, you can't practice any other virtue consistently. Without courage, you can't be consistently fair, or kind, or generous, or merciful, or just, or true, or loving. You can be anything for a while, but to be it consistently, you have to have courage. And I think that was the atmosphere, that was in the atmosphere in the village. People had courage.